What if you could be executed just for wearing the wrong color? Imagine a world where your clothing choices, your dinner menu, even the way you styled your hair could lead to fines, imprisonment, or worse. This wasn't some dystopian fiction, it was reality for countless people living under ancient legal systems. Across civilizations from Rome to Babylon, from Egypt to ancient China, lawmakers crafted rules that governed every aspect of daily life, and some of those laws were so unusual, so downright bizarre, that they challenge our very understanding of justice and order. Today, we're stepping into the shadows of history to uncover 30 of the most surprising, puzzling, and often shocking laws from antiquity, rules that reveal not just how societies functioned, but how they feared, dreamt, and attempted to control the unpredictable nature of human behavior. You might think of ancient laws as straightforward decrees about theft or murder, but the truth is far more fascinating. These legal codes were windows into the values, anxieties, and even the superstitions of their time. They weren't just about maintaining order, they were about defining identity, enforcing social hierarchies, and sometimes simply asserting power in the most peculiar ways. Think about it. Why would a society forbid certain hairstyles? Why ban specific foods on particular days? Why regulate the colors people could wear based on their social class? Each of these laws tells a story about what people cherished, what they feared, and what they were willing to punish in the name of tradition, religion, or control. This journey isn't just about listing strange rules from the past, it's about understanding the minds behind them. We'll explore how these laws shaped lives, influenced cultures, and in some cases left echoes that still resonate today. You'll discover decrees that range from the oddly specific to the breathtakingly severe, each one a piece of a larger puzzle about human civilization. So settle in and prepare to see history in a whole new light, because what you're about to learn might just change how you think about law, order, and the often surprising priorities of our ancestors. Our journey into these surprising laws begins not with a tale of bizarre punishment, but with something that feels almost modern: government-mandated price controls. We have to travel back over 4,000 years to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, to the Sumerian city of Ur, ruled by King Ur-Nammu. His legal code, inscribed on ancient clay tablets, is the oldest known set of laws we have discovered. And while it covers the expected topics like murder and theft, it also reveals a sophisticated and surprisingly early attempt to manage an entire economy. The code didn't just suggest fair prices, it legally fixed them. Imagine walking into a market in 2100 BC and knowing exactly what you should pay for a gallon of barley, a pound of wool, or a measure of copper. The law made it so. For a gur of barley, the price was set at 1 shekel of silver. This wasn't a guideline, it was the law of the land. This system was designed to create stability and fairness in a complex trade-based society. It protected the average citizen from sudden price gouging during a shortage and ensured that essential commodities remained accessible. But what happened if a merchant decided to ignore these fixed prices and charge more to make a bigger profit? The consequences were severe and immediate. The code prescribed a specific penalty for such an economic crime. The merchant would be fined a staggering 15 shekels of silver for every single shekel they overcharged. This wasn't a simple slap on the wrist or a request to return the extra money. This was a punitive fine designed to make overcharging utterly unprofitable and financially disastrous. It sends a very clear message about Sumerian values. Economic fairness and market stability weren't just nice ideas, they were pillars of public order enforced with the full weight of the law. This ancient concern for a controlled economy shows us that the struggle to balance free trade with consumer protection is not a modern invention, but a challenge that has preoccupied civilizations since the very dawn of law itself. While the Sumerians were regulating prices to ensure fairness, another Mesopotamian civilization was enacting laws to protect something even more vital to survival, the food supply. Just a few centuries after Ur-Nammu in the city-state of Isin, King Lipit-Ishtar issued a legal code that included a very specific rule about trees. But this wasn't just any tree. This law was all about the date palm. In ancient Mesopotamia, the date palm was far more than just a plant. It was a cornerstone of life. It provided sugary, nutrient-rich fruit that could be dried and stored for times of famine. Its wood was an essential building material, and its leaves could be woven into baskets and mats. A thriving date palm orchard was a family's livelihood and a community's insurance policy against hunger. Recognizing this immense value, Lipit-Ishtar's code contained a law designed to fiercely protect these precious resources. It stated that if a man cut down a tree in another man's orchard without permission, he would face a serious penalty. The law wasn't a simple fine, it was a demand for complete restitution. The offender was required to pay the orchard's owner a specific weight of silver, but the payment didn't stop there. The true genius of this law was its focus on restoration, not just punishment. The person who caused the damage was also legally obligated to replace the tree he had destroyed. This reveals a remarkably forward-thinking understanding of economics and ecology. The lawmakers understood that the loss wasn't merely the value of the wood or the fruit on that single tree. It was the loss of all the fruit that tree would have produced for decades to come. A date palm can take years to mature and bear fruit, so cutting one down was an attack on future prosperity. By forcing the culprit to both pay a fine and plant a new tree, the law addressed both the immediate financial injury and the long-term agricultural damage. This wasn't just about compensating a person, it was about healing the land itself and ensuring the community's continued survival. It shows a legal system deeply connected to the environmental and economic realities of its time, where protecting a single tree was seen as crucial for upholding the entire social order. Leaving the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, we journey north to the rugged highlands of Anatolia, home to the formidable Hittite Empire. Here, around 1650 BC, a legal tradition emerged that might seem utterly bewildering to our modern sensibilities. The Hittites compiled a comprehensive set of laws, and among them were statutes that didn't just punish people for crimes. They put animals on trial. This wasn't a metaphorical or superstitious ritual. It was a formal, codified part of their legal system. If an ox gored a person and caused their death, that ox could be found guilty and face execution. The law didn't stop with livestock either. If a pig caused a fatal injury, the pig too could be subjected to a trial and a state-sanctioned punishment. To us, this seems like a bizarre miscarriage of justice, holding a creature without human reasoning capabilities accountable for its instincts. But for the Hittites, this was a perfectly logical extension of their worldview, deeply rooted in animistic spiritual beliefs. They saw the world as filled with spirits or daemons, inhabiting everything from rivers and mountains to trees and animals. In this framework, an animal wasn't just a mindless beast acting on impulse. It was a vessel capable of intentionality, malice, and moral agency. A goring ox wasn't merely dangerous, it was evil, possessed by a malevolent spirit or acting out its own wicked will. Therefore, it couldn't just be put down as a public safety hazard. It had to be formally tried and executed to purge the community of that spiritual corruption and restore cosmic balance. The punishment served a dual purpose. On a practical level, it removed a dangerous animal from the community. On a spiritual level, it was a form of purification, a way to appease the gods and the family of the victim by demonstrating that the source of the evil had been utterly eradicated. This concept reflects a society where the line between the natural and the supernatural was incredibly blurred. Law was not just a tool for social order, but a mechanism for maintaining spiritual harmony. The Hittite animal trials force us to reconsider our own assumptions about justice, responsibility, and the ancient minds' profound connection to the natural world, a world they believed was watching, judging, and acting with purpose right alongside them. The Hittites saw justice as a matter of balancing the cosmic scales, even if that meant putting an animal on trial. But one of their neighbors took the concept of proportional punishment to an entirely different and far more brutal level. We arrive now at perhaps the most famous set of laws from the ancient world, the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a towering black stone stele for all to see. These 282 laws issued by the Babylonian king around 1754 BC were meant to leave no doubt about the consequences of breaking the rules. And while many of the laws deal with standard legal fare, one category stands out for its startlingly modern concept and its shockingly ancient form of enforcement: builder accountability. In a growing, ambitious city like Babylon, construction was constant. Palaces, temples, and homes for the wealthy elite were rising everywhere, and with that boom came the potential for shoddy, dangerous work. Hammurabi's code addressed this directly with a series of laws that would make any modern contractor break into a cold sweat. The code laid out a clear, tiered system of liability that held builders financially and physically responsible for their workmanship for years after a project was completed. If a builder constructed a house for someone and did not make his work strong, and the house he built collapsed and killed the owner, then that builder was to be put to death. It was that simple. The law didn't see it as a tragic accident. It was negligent homicide, but the code went into even more chilling detail. If the collapsing house killed the son of the owner, then the principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, best known as an eye for an eye, was applied in its most literal and horrifying form. The law stated that not the builder, but the builder's own son would be put to death. This feels monstrously unjust to us, and it should, but within the context of Babylonian society, it was a gruesome form of logic. The value of a man's son was immeasurable, representing his lineage, his legacy, and his future security. The death of the owner's son wasn't just a personal loss, it was the destruction of a family line. The punishment was designed to be perfectly proportional, inflicting an identical loss upon the guilty party to create a terrifyingly precise balance. It was a stark warning that the consequences of negligence would echo through generations. Yet, for all its brutality, this legal framework also established some of the world's first consumer protection standards. The code wasn't only about punishment, it was about restitution and quality assurance. If a house collapsed but didn't kill anyone, merely destroying property, the builder was legally obligated to rebuild the house at his own expense. Even more fascinating, if a builder did subpar work, for instance, if the walls started to crumble, he was required to repair the defects and reinforce the structure again entirely at his own cost. This created a powerful economic incentive for builders to use the best materials and the most skilled labor they could find. Their very lives and the lives of their children depended on the integrity of their work. This system, for all its harshness, effectively placed the entire long-term risk of a construction project onto the builder, not the consumer. It was a guarantee of quality that was enforced with the ultimate threat. So, while we rightfully recoil at the barbaric punishment, we can also see the seeds of our modern warranty systems and liability laws within Hammurabi's code, a stark reminder that the desire for accountability and safe craftsmanship is as ancient as civilization itself, even if the methods for ensuring it were drastically different. While Hammurabi used the threat of death to ensure quality construction, another ancient civilization discovered a far more positive incentive to keep its massive building projects on track: beer. We now travel to the banks of the Nile, where the hot Egyptian sun beat down on one of the most ambitious construction sites in human history, the raising of the Great Pyramids. For a long time, popular imagination pictured this work being done by vast armies of groaning slaves, whipped into submission. But archaeological evidence and records from work camps like those at Giza paint a very different and much more fascinating picture. These laborers were not slaves, they were skilled state employees, and their compensation package included one of history's most surprising legal entitlements. Around 2000 BC, Egyptian law actually mandated that these workers be paid in part with a daily beer ration, and we're not talking about a small serving. Each laborer was legally entitled to receive 4 to 5 liters of beer every single day. To us, that sounds like a recipe for a permanently drunk and completely unproductive workforce. But in the context of ancient Egypt, this law was a stroke of genius that addressed health, happiness, and logistics all at once. First, we have to forget our modern concept of beer. Egyptian beer, known as henket, was a thick, porridge-like substance. It was nutritious, not just intoxicating. Brewed from fermented barley bread, it was packed with carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals, effectively serving as a liquid bread that provided a huge caloric boost for men engaged in back-breaking physical labor. In an environment where water sources could easily be contaminated with bacteria from the Nile, beer was also significantly safer to drink. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water and then fermenting the mixture, killed off harmful pathogens, making it a hygienic and hydrating beverage. So, this mandated ration was essentially a guaranteed supply of safe hydration, nutrition, and calories, all rolled into one. It was a practical solution to the immense challenge of feeding thousands of workers in a remote desert location. This beer ration was a formal part of the workers' wages, which also included bread, grain, vegetables, and even fish. Records from Deir el-Medina, the village housing the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, show detailed and meticulous accounting of these distributions. The state ensured these payments were made regularly and fairly because a happy worker was a productive worker. The promise of a reliable, high-quality beer ration would have been a powerful motivator, helping to attract and retain the skilled labor needed for projects that could take decades to complete. It fostered a sense of community and goodwill, turning the work camp into not just a construction site but a functioning society with its own economy and social structure. This early form of labor law reveals a sophisticated understanding of worker welfare and project management. The pharaohs and their administrators weren't just brutal taskmasters. They were pragmatic managers who recognized that the most effective way to build an eternal monument was to ensure the people laying the stones were well-fed, hydrated, and motivated. The Great Pyramids, therefore, stand not as monuments built by the crack of a whip, but by the promise of a cool, nutritious jug of beer at the end of a long, hard day. But of course, the promise of a daily beer ration was a privilege reserved for state-employed laborers. In other ancient societies, the idea of not working at all wasn't just frowned upon, it was a crime against the state itself. Now we sail across the Mediterranean to ancient Athens in the 6th century BC, a city buzzing with the radical new idea of democracy. Yet, for all its talk of freedom and citizen participation, this nascent democracy had a deep-seated fear of idleness. It was here that the great lawgiver Solon, tasked with preventing civil war between the rich and the poor, introduced a series of sweeping reforms, and among them was a law that might shock our modern sensibilities. It was illegal to be lazy. Solon's law specifically targeted what was called arger, the state of being an argos, an idle, useless person with no visible means of support. In the eyes of the Athenian state, a citizen who did not work was not just a burden, he was an active threat to the social fabric. The law stated that any citizen could be prosecuted for failing to have a recognized occupation or a clear source of income. This wasn't a vague suggestion, it was an enforceable statute. If a person was accused of idleness, they could be dragged into court and forced to justify how they sustained themselves. A conviction could lead to severe penalties, including the loss of certain citizen rights or hefty fines. To understand this, we have to look at the core values of Athenian society. The Greek concept of arete, excellence or virtue, was deeply tied to action and contribution. A man proved his worth through participation in public life, through hard work, and through providing for his family. Idleness was seen as the opposite of virtue. It was a form of social parasitism. But Solon's law wasn't just about enforcing a work ethic. It was a brilliantly pragmatic piece of social policy designed to address two very real dangers in a fragile democracy. The first was the fear of poverty-driven crime. A man with no income, no land, and no trade was a man with nothing to lose. He might turn to theft, banditry, or become a hired thug for a wealthy oligarch, destabilizing the entire polis. By legally compelling every citizen to be productive, Solon aimed to eliminate this root cause of criminal behavior and ensure every man had a stake in the system's stability. The second, perhaps more profound fear was of political sedition. Athenian democracy was brand new and incredibly vulnerable. The wealthy elite had recently lost some of their absolute power, and the poor masses now had a voice. A class of idle, disgruntled citizens, particularly young men from formerly wealthy families who had fallen on hard times, represented a perfect pool of recruits for a would-be tyrant. A charismatic leader could easily rally these desperate, unemployed men to his cause, promising them riches and power in exchange for helping him overthrow the democratic government. By making idleness illegal, Solon sought to dry up this reservoir of potential political agitators. He gave them no choice but to find a trade, farm a plot of land, or engage in commerce, to become invested in the peaceful, productive functioning of the state rather than its destruction. It's fascinating to note that Solon himself was a merchant, and his laws reflected a new respect for the dignity of labor and crafts. He reportedly granted citizenship to foreign craftsmen who came to Athens to practice their trade, and his laws against idleness applied to all citizens regardless of their former social standing. This created a powerful cultural shift, forcing the aristocratic elite to at least pay lip service to the idea that every citizen must contribute. The law against idleness, therefore, was more than a quirky ancient statute. It was a foundational pillar in the construction of the Athenian identity, weaving together economic necessity, political security, and moral virtue into a single, enforceable command to simply get to work. While the Athenians were legally compelling their citizens to work, their fierce rivals, the Spartans, were legislating something even more personal, the very act of starting a family. In the rigid, militaristic society of 7th century BC Sparta, the needs of the state trumped all individual desires, and this was nowhere more evident than in their marriage laws. Unlike other Greek city-states that saw marriage as a private family arrangement, Sparta treated it as a matter of national security. The law was brutally straightforward. A Spartan man, a full citizen known as a Spartiate, was required to be married by the age of 30. For a Spartan woman, the deadline was even earlier, by the age of 20. Failure to comply wasn't just a personal choice, it was a crime against the state with serious, humiliating consequences. A man who remained unmarried past 30 faced a gradual but devastating erosion of his status. He could be stripped of the full rights of citizenship, which for a Spartiate meant everything. He might be excluded from participating in the public assembly, losing his political voice. Even more painfully, he could be barred from attending the syssitia, the mandatory common meals that were the very heart of Spartan male social and military bonding. To be shut out of these gatherings was to be rendered a social pariah, an outsider in his own community. But the pressure didn't stop there. The state orchestrated a truly unique form of public shaming specifically for bachelors. During certain religious festivals, particularly the Gymnopedia, a festival of naked youths, unmarried men were forced to march around a public space completely naked. While their married counterparts were celebrated, these single men were subjected to jeers and ridicule from the entire community, including the women. They were also compelled to sing a song or chant verses that essentially amounted to a public confession of their failure to serve the state. This ritual humiliation was designed to weaponize social shame, making the personal failure to marry a subject of very public scorn. For women, the pressure was equally intense, though applied differently. An unmarried woman past 20 would bring shame upon her entire family, damaging their standing within the intensely competitive Spartan aristocracy. Her prospects for a good match would diminish rapidly, as she would be seen as flawed or disobedient. The state's goal was absolute: to ensure every citizen of prime reproductive age was actively contributing to the one resource Sparta valued above all else: its population of future soldiers. This wasn't about romance, lineage, or even personal legacy. This was a cold, calculated policy of state-sponsored eugenics. The entire Spartan system, known as the agoge, was meticulously engineered to produce the finest warriors in Greece. Weak or disabled infants were famously exposed to die. Boys were taken from their homes at age 7 to endure decades of brutal military training. The marriage laws were simply the logical extension of this philosophy, ensuring a constant and optimal supply of new children to feed into this relentless machine. The law even dictated the best conditions for procreation. Men who lived in barracks until age 30 were encouraged to visit their wives secretly at night, a practice believed to increase desire and, by extension, the vigor of the offspring. The state actively encouraged older men with young wives to allow younger, fitter men to father children with them, all in the name of producing stronger babies. The health and strength of the mother were also paramount, as Spartan women underwent physical training unlike anywhere else in Greece, not for battle but to ensure they could bear strong children. In the Spartan mind, the body of every citizen was not their own property. It was an asset of the state to be managed and utilized for the singular purpose of military supremacy. Their marriage mandates reveal a society so utterly devoted to its military ideal that it legally commanded love, orchestrated conception, and turned the most intimate human relationship into a public duty. But the Spartan obsession with controlling its citizens' lives for military ends seems almost benign compared to the brutal economic reality faced by the common people of early Rome. Just a few centuries after the Spartan marriage laws, the fledgling Roman Republic was grappling with its own social crisis, one that pitted the wealthy elite against the desperate poor. The result was a legal code so severe in its treatment of debt that it shocks the conscience even today. We now turn to the 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code, established around 450 BCE. Created to end the arbitrary rule of patrician magistrates and make the laws public for all citizens to see, the 12 Tables covered everything from inheritance to property disputes. But one set of provisions, those dealing with debt, stand out for their breathtaking cruelty. The law was chillingly clear on the fate of a debtor who defaulted on a loan. After a formal court judgment, the creditor was granted immense power over the debtor's very person. The code stated that the creditor could physically seize the defaulting debtor, bind him in chains, and hold him prisoner. The debtor was then given 30 days to somehow come up with the money, often while languishing in a private prison. If that grace period expired with no payment, the creditor's rights expanded into the realm of the horrific. The law gave the creditor two stark options. The first was to sell the debtor into slavery across the Tiber River, meaning to a foreign people outside Roman territory. This was a fate worse than death for a Roman citizen, stripping him of his identity, his freedom, and his homeland in one brutal transaction. But the second option is the one that has echoed through history as a symbol of ancient severity. The 12 Tables explicitly stated that if there were multiple creditors, the law permitted them to literally cut the debtor's body into pieces and divide it among themselves. The Latin phrase parts secanto, let them cut parts, is one of the most coldly terrifying commands ever inscribed into law. To understand this, we must look beyond the grotesque surface and into the early Roman mind. This wasn't merely about sadism or excessive punishment. It was a stark, literal manifestation of the Roman concept of nexum, a form of debt bondage where a person's body was the security for a loan. In the eyes of the law, a debtor who could not pay had not just failed a financial agreement, he had stolen the property of the creditor. His body itself became the forfeited collateral. The right to dismember was likely a legal fiction, a terrifying threat never actually carried out but designed to force the debtor's family or clansmen to intervene and pay the debt at the last possible moment to avoid an unthinkable atrocity. It was the ultimate leverage. The true goal was almost always enslavement, either to the creditor himself or to a foreign buyer, which transformed the debtor from a financial liability into a tangible asset, literally working off the debt through a lifetime of forced labor. This brutal system reveals the absolute primacy of contract and property rights in early Roman society. The stability of commerce and the sanctity of a loan agreement were considered so fundamental to the Republic's survival that they were enforced with the most extreme sanctions imaginable. It was a world where financial obligation was not just a matter of money, but a matter of honor and literal physical consequence. The screams of debt slaves eventually led to political upheaval, with the plebeians seceding from the city to demand reform, which slowly led to the abolition of nexum. But for a time, the law of the 12 tables made it terrifyingly clear that in Rome, a man who could not pay his debts forfeited not just his property, but his very humanity. While the Romans were binding debtors in chains for failing to meet private financial obligations, an empire to the east was building a system of communication so efficient and so vital to the state that interfering with it was considered a crime against the king himself. We journey now to the vast Achaemenid Persian Empire under the rule of Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE. To administer a realm that stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, encompassing dozens of different cultures and languages, Darius needed more than just armies. He needed information to travel faster than rebellion could spread. His brilliant solution was the Royal Road, a masterpiece of ancient infrastructure stretching over 1,600 miles from the capital of Susa to the city of Sardis near the coast of Anatolia. But the road itself was just stone and dirt. What truly made it revolutionary was the set of laws Darius enacted to govern its use, creating what many historians consider the world's first highly reliable long-distance postal system. Central to this system was the royal messenger. These men were the lifeblood of the empire, carrying everything from tax records and census data to military orders and intelligence reports. To ensure their speed was unimpeded, Darius issued a decree that established a network of roadside inns or stations at regular intervals along the entire route. The law mandated that each of these stations must always be stocked with a fresh horse and a dedicated rider, ready at a moment's notice. The moment a messenger, weary and dust-covered from his hard ride, thundered into a station, he could immediately transfer his important packages to the fresh, waiting rider. This new courier would then sprint off to the next station, where the process would repeat. This relay system meant a message could travel the entire immense length of the Royal Road in just 7 to 9 days, a journey that would take a single traveler on foot over 3 months. It was an astonishing feat of logistical planning, but the law went beyond mere logistics. It carried the absolute authority of the king. The royal messengers, identifiable by their official insignia, had a legal right-of-way that was nearly absolute. The law stated that anyone or anything that delayed a royal messenger was committing a grave offense. If a farmer's cart blocked a narrow bridge, it had to be moved immediately. If a local official tried to detain a messenger for questioning, he was breaking the king's law. The penalties for causing such a delay were severe and terrifyingly vague, designed to deter interference through fear. Historical accounts suggest the punishment could be anything from heavy fines and imprisonment to execution, left to the discretion of regional governors who understood that the messenger's speed was synonymous with the king's will. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about the projection of power. The relentless pace of the messengers was a constant, visible reminder to every province that the eye of the king was always watching, and his reach was instantaneous. This system was so effective and so admired that it inspired future empires for centuries. The Greek historian Herodotus, often a critic of Persia, couldn't help but express his awe, famously writing, "There is nothing in the world that travels faster than these Persian couriers." He noted that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stayed these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, a phrase that would much later be adopted as the unofficial creed of the United States Postal Service. Darius's regulations transformed the royal road from a simple path into a central nervous system for a superpower. It bound a sprawling, diverse empire together not just with stone, but with law and the relentless, galloping pace of information, proving that in the ancient world, the true key to power wasn't always the strength of your sword arm, but the speed of your news. Yet even the terrifying efficiency of the Persian messenger system pales in comparison to the micromanaging control exerted by one of history's most notorious legalists. We now travel east to 3rd century BC China, a land freshly unified under the brutal yet brilliantly effective rule of the first emperor Qin Shi Huang. Having conquered 6 warring states to create a single empire, the emperor and his chief advisor, Lai Si, faced an immense challenge: how to mold a collection of diverse cultures with their own languages, customs, and loyalties into one obedient, homogeneous nation. Their philosophy was legalism, a belief that strict, harsh, and uniformly applied laws were the only tools capable of maintaining order and suppressing dissent. And from this philosophy emerged some of the most surprising and intrusive laws ever recorded, including one that specifically targeted the hair on a man's face. The Qin dynasty implemented a tax on beards. This wasn't a simple vanity tax or a quirky revenue scheme. It was a deeply calculated act of political and cultural engineering. For the nomadic tribes living on the northern and western frontiers of the empire, particularly the Xiongnu people, growing a thick, long beard was a powerful cultural symbol. It represented masculinity, wisdom, and a rugged independence that was intrinsically tied to their pastoral, horse-riding way of life, a way of life that was the complete antithesis of the settled, regimented agricultural society the Qin emperor was trying to force upon everyone. To the central Qin government in Xianyang, a beard wasn't just facial hair. It was a flag of defiance, a visible declaration that the wearer still identified more with the old nomadic traditions than with the new, unified Chinese state. The beard tax was designed to punish this expression of cultural identity. By making it financially burdensome to maintain a beard, the law aimed to literally shave away the outward signs of difference and force assimilation. A man who chose to keep his beard was not only making a statement, he was also making a recurring payment directly to the state coffers, effectively funding the very system that sought to erase his heritage. But the law's cleverness didn't stop at border control. Within the heartland of China, the tax served a second, equally important purpose: enforcing a rigid social hierarchy and a specific standard of appearance. The Qin legal code was obsessed with categorization and order. Every person had a designated place, and their outward appearance was expected to reflect their station. Well-groomed faces, or the lack of facial hair entirely, became associated with the civilized, scholarly, and obedient bureaucrats who served the emperor. A beard, by contrast, could be seen as unkempt, rustic, or even barbaric. The tax therefore created a financial incentive for men to adopt the correct Qin appearance, aligning their personal grooming with the state-approved image of a loyal subject. It was a form of social pressure that used economics to dictate fashion and identity. For the poorest peasants who could scarcely afford another tax, the choice was simple and brutal: shave or face the financial consequences. This turned the simple act of shaving into a daily performed act of submission to the Qin state. The enforcement of this law, like all Qin laws, was predictably severe. Tax collectors and local magistrates would have been responsible for identifying and fining bearded men. Failure to pay could result in penalties that ranged from heavy fines and forced labor on the emperor's massive construction projects, including the Great Wall and his elaborate tomb, to more brutal corporal punishments. The beard tax stands as a stunning example of how an ancient government sought to control its population, not just through fear of overt punishment, but by manipulating the most personal aspects of daily life. It reveals a belief that true unity couldn't be achieved merely by conquering territory. It had to be sewn into the very fabric of society, one shaved face at a time. The Qin dynasty's obsession with conformity was so absolute that it sought to legislate the hair on a man's chin, proving that in the quest for total control, no detail was too small to escape the reach of the law. While the Qin dynasty was taxing beards to enforce cultural conformity, a contemporary empire on the Indian subcontinent was pioneering a radically different kind of legislation, one that extended the protection of the law to its most vulnerable subjects who couldn't even speak for themselves. Just decades after the Qin emperor's death, the great Mauryan emperor Ashoka, ruling over most of the Indian subcontinent in the 3rd century BCE, underwent a profound transformation. Horrified by the immense bloodshed he had caused in his brutal conquest of Kalinga, Ashoka converted to Buddhism and renounced violence. But his conversion wasn't just a personal spiritual shift. It became the foundation for a revolutionary legal project that would echo through the centuries. Ashoka issued a series of edicts carved onto rocks and pillars across his vast empire that established what historians recognize as the world's first comprehensive animal welfare laws. This wasn't a single statute but an entire legal framework built on the Buddhist principle of ahimsa, or non-violence towards all living beings. Ashoka's laws were astonishingly detailed and systematic. First, he established what we would now call a protected species list. His rock edicts explicitly named certain animals that were never to be slaughtered or harmed under any circumstances. This list included entirely practical animals like bulls and dairy cows, which were essential for agriculture and nourishment, but it also included creatures that held no obvious economic value, such as parrots, bats, and queen ants. The inclusion of these smaller animals reveals a philosophy that went far beyond utility. It was a genuine belief in the intrinsic value of all life. Furthermore, Ashoka banned the ritual sacrifice of animals in the capital city, a direct challenge to long-standing Vedic traditions. This was a bold move that placed his new ethical principles above established religious practice. But Ashoka's vision extended beyond simply banning killing. He actively regulated industries that used animals. His edicts placed strict limits on the number of creatures that could be slaughtered for food in the royal kitchens, drastically reducing the daily consumption of meat. He even mandated specific non-slaughter days, effectively creating meatless holidays throughout the year. Perhaps most remarkably, he instituted laws governing the treatment of animals in slaughterhouses themselves, requiring that their suffering be minimized, an unprecedented concern for the welfare of creatures destined for consumption. His commitment didn't end there. Recognizing that animals fall ill and suffer, Ashoka decreed the establishment of veterinary hospitals throughout his empire. Just as he built hospitals for his human subjects, he ordered the creation of facilities where sick and injured animals could receive medical care. He even had medicinal herbs imported and planted across his realm so that both people and animals would have access to treatment. This holistic approach to public health, which included all sentient beings, was a concept that wouldn't be seen again in state policy for over a millennium. To enforce these visionary laws, Ashoka created a whole new class of government officials called the Dhamma Mahamantras, or ministers of morality. These were not just tax collectors or soldiers, they were essentially early animal welfare officers. Their duties included traveling the empire to educate people about the new laws, ensuring compliance in markets and villages, and likely investigating reports of cruelty. This institutional framework gave teeth to his proclamations, turning philosophical ideals into enforceable legal reality. The motivation behind all this was not sentimental but deeply spiritual and pragmatic. Ashoka believed that a kingdom characterized by compassion and non-violence would be blessed by the gods and would prosper. He saw the protection of the weak, whether human or animal, as the hallmark of a civilized and righteous society. His rock edicts make this clear, stating that his laws were passed for the following purpose: that they may be free from the cruelty to living beings. In a world where ancient law was so often a tool for punishment and control, Ashoka's animal welfare provisions stand as a breathtaking anomaly, a code of compassion that sought to build a more merciful world for every single living thing within his domain. Yet even the profound compassion of Ashoka's laws stands in stark contrast to one of the most unsettling and controversial practices of the ancient world, a ritual so dark that even the society that practiced it eventually passed a law to try and stop it. We now sail to the coast of North Africa, to the powerful mercantile empire of Carthage in the 4th century BCE. Founded by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, Carthage grew into a dominant force in the Mediterranean, a hub of trade, naval power, and sophisticated culture. But it also carried with it a religious tradition that both fascinated and horrified its Greek and Roman rivals: the sacrifice of children to the city's chief god, Baal-Hamon, and his consort, Tanit. For centuries, the Tophet, a sacred, open-air precinct in the city, was the site of this practice. Archaeological evidence, in the form of thousands of small urn burials containing the charred bones of infants and young children, suggests this was not merely myth but a deeply entrenched institution. The Romans, who would eventually raze Carthage to the ground, propagated stories of a bronze statue of Baal with outstretched arms, under which a fire would be lit, rolling the sacrificed children into the flames. While the Roman accounts are undoubtedly filled with propaganda, the physical evidence from the Tophet is undeniable and chilling, which is why a discovery from this same period is so truly surprising. Around the year 310 BCE, as Carthage was engaged in a brutal war with Syracuse, a law was passed that explicitly forbade the practice of child sacrifice. This wasn't a vague reform. It was a direct legal prohibition against the very ritual that had been a cornerstone of Carthaginian state religion for generations. We know of this law from the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who recounts that during a moment of extreme crisis in the war, the Carthaginian aristocracy, seeking to appease the gods, decided to recommit to the old practice. They secretly selected 200 children from their most noble families to be sacrificed, believing their earlier abandonment of the ritual had caused their military misfortune. But when this plan became public, Diodorus writes, the people were outraged because a law had been passed to forbid such sacrifices. This reveals a staggering shift in public morality and religious belief. A significant portion of Carthaginian society had come to see this ancient practice not as a sacred duty, but as a barbaric act that needed to be outlawed. The archaeological record powerfully supports this narrative of change. Analysis of the bones in the Tophet shows a clear evolution over time. In the earliest layers, the vast majority of the remains are those of very young children, from newborns to toddlers. But in the layers dating to the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, precisely the time of this purported law, a fascinating shift occurs. The remains of infants decrease dramatically and are replaced by those of older children and, even more tellingly, animal bones. The charred remains of sheep, goats, and birds begin to appear in the urns, buried with the same solemnity and ritual care as the human sacrifices before them. This is the sound of a society in transition, caught between the weight of centuries-old tradition and the pull of a new ethical consciousness. The law did not abolish the form of the ritual. Instead, it seems to have transformed its substance. The outward practice of offering a sacred gift to the gods continued, but the gift itself was substituted. This is known as a votive substitution, a common way for religions to modernize without completely breaking from tradition. The life force of a lamb became a symbolic replacement for the life force of a child. This profound change did not happen in a vacuum. It was almost certainly driven by the growing influence of the Greek world, with whom Carthage had extensive and often peaceful trade and cultural contact. Greek philosophy, with its humanistic currents, and Greek religion, which had largely moved away from human sacrifice centuries earlier, presented a different model of piety, one where honoring the gods did not require the ultimate price. The Carthaginian elite, who were deeply engaged with the Hellenistic world, would have been exposed to these ideas. To remain a respected power in the Mediterranean, to be seen as civilized rather than barbaric by their Greek counterparts, Carthage may have felt pressure to align its practices with emerging cosmopolitan norms. The ban on child sacrifice, therefore, is more than just a law. It is a window into a society undergoing an identity crisis, torn between its Phoenician heritage and a new, more Hellenized future. It shows us that even the most deeply rooted traditions are not immune to the forces of cultural exchange and the slow, difficult, but undeniable evolution of human conscience. Moving from the heavy-handed cultural engineering of the kin-beard tax, we find a similar but even more forceful attempt to legislate appearance just a few centuries later in a very different empire. As the Roman Empire fractured, its eastern half evolved into what we now call the Byzantine Empire, centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople. And in the 6th century CE, one of its most famous rulers, Emperor Justinian the Great, decided that the face of his empire needed a clean shave. He issued a sweeping law that made beards illegal throughout his realm. This wasn't a tax or a suggestion, it was an outright prohibition, and its enforcement was both bizarre and severe. Any man who chose to keep his beard would be subject to hefty fines and public scorn. But the law went a step further, placing an incredible burden on an entire profession, barbers. Justinian's decree legally obligated every barber in the empire to shave any customer who sat in their chair, whether the customer wanted it or not. A barber who allowed a man to leave his shop with a beard, or who even agreed to simply trim a beard instead of removing it entirely, could himself be punished. This turned the local barbershop from a place of grooming and gossip into an outpost of the imperial will, where the state literally held a razor to the throat of personal expression. To understand why a powerful emperor would be so obsessed with facial hair, we have to look at the political and cultural landscape of the time. Justinian was a man with a monumental vision. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory, reconquering lost territories in the West and creating a unified, powerful Christian state. A key part of this project was defining a clear Byzantine identity, one that was civilized, Roman, and Orthodox. And in Justinian's eyes, beards were a major problem because they were the hallmark of his enemies. To the east, the Byzantine Empire's arch-nemesis was the Sasanian Persian Empire. Persian men, from the Shahanshah down to the common soldier, were almost universally bearded, often styling their facial hair with great care as a symbol of wisdom and maturity. Justinian needed his citizens to look nothing like these Zoroastrian rivals. Furthermore, many of the so-called barbarian tribes that had overrun the Western Roman Empire, the Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, also favored long, untamed beards, which the clean-shaven Romans had historically associated with uncivilized peoples. By banning beards, Justinian was drawing a literal line in the sand between his civilized Christian Romans and the bearded, barbaric other. It was a powerful visual propaganda tool. A clean-shaven face became a badge of loyalty, a sign that you were a true subject of the emperor and a member of the advanced Byzantine civilization. This law also had a significant religious dimension. Justinian was a fervent Christian who involved himself deeply in theological disputes. Within the early church, there was a debate about the portrayal of Christ. Older traditions, influenced by Greek philosophers, often depicted Jesus with a beard, symbolizing his wisdom and eternal nature. However, a newer tradition was emerging, particularly in the East, that preferred a more youthful, clean-shaven Christ, emphasizing his purity and resurrection. Justinian strongly favored this clean-shaven iconography as part of his broader push to standardize Christian doctrine and practice. By forcing his subjects to shave, he was aligning the entire population with his specific theological vision, making the empire's face reflect his idea of a pious Christian faith. The law, therefore, was far more than a sumptuary regulation about fashion. It was a multifaceted tool of statecraft designed to reinforce cultural unity, demonize foreign adversaries, promote a specific religious aesthetic, and project an image of absolute imperial control right down to the cheeks and chins of every man in the empire. It shows us that for an autocrat like Justinian, no aspect of life was too personal to escape the reach of a law if it could be harnessed to serve the power and identity of the state. Yet even the most intrusive appearance laws of the Byzantine Empire could not match the sheer life and death gravity of a legal code emerging from the chaotic aftermath of Rome's collapse. As the Western Roman Empire fractured into various Germanic kingdoms, one of these new states crafted a set of laws so meticulous, so far-reaching in its attempt to impose order, that it even legislated the dangers hanging from the branches of a tree. We now travel to 7th century CE Hispania, to the kingdom of the Visigoths and their monumental legal achievement, the Visigothic Code or Forum Judicum. This massive compilation of laws was one of the most sophisticated of the early medieval period, and buried within its extensive regulations is a startlingly modern concept of responsibility. The law stated that if a property owner had a tree that bore poisonous fruit and a person ate that fruit and died, the tree's owner was held legally liable for the death. This was not a mere suggestion of moral fault, it was an enforceable legal statute with clear penalties. The owner was required to pay a significant weregild, a man price in compensation to the family of the victim. Failure to make this payment could result in the owner facing severe punishment themselves, potentially including their own death or enslavement. To our modern ears, this might sound like a straightforward case of negligence. But in the context of the early medieval world, this law was revolutionary. It represented a huge leap from older, more simplistic legal traditions that often focused only on direct intentional harm. Under many earlier Germanic law codes, if you did not actively attack someone, you were not considered responsible for their misfortune. This Visigothic law introduced a radical new idea, a duty of care. It asserted that property ownership was not just a right, it came with inherent responsibilities toward the safety of others. A landowner now had a legal obligation to be aware of the hazards on their property and to take steps to mitigate them. A tree with known poisonous fruit could not simply be left to its own devices. The law implicitly demanded action. Perhaps the tree should be cut down, its branches trimmed beyond reach, or a clear warning given to the community. To do nothing was to choose negligence, and that choice now had a price tag attached, measured in human life. This legislation reveals a fascinatingly pragmatic approach to public health and safety in a pre-scientific age. People in the 7th century obviously didn't understand biochemistry or toxicology, but they were keen observers of the natural world. They knew from experience that certain berries or fruits caused sickness and death. The law codified this folk knowledge, transforming common sense into a legal requirement. It was an early form of consumer protection, albeit an unintentional one. In an era where foraging for wild foods was still a common practice, especially for the poor, the law placed the burden of preventing accidental poisoning on the person who controlled the source of the poison, the landowner. This protected not only invited guests but also trespassers, a concept that wouldn't fully take root in modern law for centuries. The law's true brilliance, however, lies in its mechanism for justice. By requiring a financial compensation to the victim's family, the code provided a practical solution that aimed to heal the social fabric rather than simply punish. A death created a void, often leaving a family without a provider and triggering a cycle of vengeance and blood feuds. The weregild payment served as a restorative tool. It compensated the family for their tangible loss, helped prevent a retaliatory killing, and allowed the community to move forward without further violence. This shifted the focus from pure retribution to a more sophisticated form of conflict resolution. The Visigothic Code's poisonous tree law, therefore, is far more than a curious antique. It is a remarkable early precedent for modern legal doctrines like premises liability and negligent homicide, showcasing a sophisticated understanding that true justice sometimes means holding someone accountable not for what they did, but for what they failed to do. While Emperor Justinian was mandating clean shaves and the Visigoths were holding landowners responsible for their poisonous trees, an entirely different kind of legal framework was being perfected on the Indian subcontinent, one that sought to regulate not just actions but the very substances a person consumed. We turn now to one of the most influential and controversial texts in human history, the Manusmriti, or the Laws of Manu. Composed roughly around the 2nd century BC, this ancient Hindu legal code is far more than a simple list of crimes and punishments. It is a comprehensive guide to life, prescribing everything from moral conduct and civil law to the most intimate details of daily ritual purity. And at the heart of this system of purity was a complex web of dietary laws so elaborate that they dictated what a person could eat, when they could eat it, and who they could eat it with, all based on their birth into the rigid social hierarchy of the caste system. The Manusmriti's approach to food was not primarily about health or nutrition in a modern sense. It was about maintaining cosmic and social order. The concept of sattva, or purity, was paramount. Every food was believed to possess inherent qualities that could influence a person's physical state, mental clarity, and spiritual standing. Foods were categorized into 3 gunas, or modes of nature: sattvic pure, promoting clarity and goodness; rajasic passionate, promoting energy and action; and tamasic dull, promoting ignorance and inertia. The law's purpose was to guide each caste toward the diet that would best help them perform their divinely ordained duty, or dharma. For a Brahmin, the priestly class at the top of the hierarchy, the goal was to maintain maximum purity to perform sacred rituals and pursue spiritual knowledge. Their diet was therefore strictly limited to sattvic foods, mild, nourishing, and simple substances like milk, ghee, fruits, grains, and certain vegetables that were believed to calm the mind and body. This is where we encounter some of the code's most surprising and specific prohibitions. The Manusmriti explicitly forbids Brahmins from eating garlic, onions, mushrooms, and leeks. To our modern palate, these are flavor-packed staples, but to the ancient lawgivers, they were dangerous and disruptive. These foods were classified as rajasic and tamasic. They were thought to be overly stimulating, heating the body and agitating the mind. Garlic and onions were believed to incite passions, anger, and sexual desire, emotions utterly incompatible with the serene, detached state a Brahmin was meant to cultivate. Eating such a food was not just a dietary choice, it was an act of spiritual pollution that could derail a Brahmin from his path, render him unfit to perform rituals, and diminish his social standing. The prohibition against mushrooms likely stemmed from their nature. Growing in the dark, damp, and decaying matter of the forest floor, they were seen as fundamentally tamasic, born of ignorance and inertia, and thus harmful to the pursuit of enlightenment. The laws grew even more intricate when it came to who prepared the food. A high-caste individual could be polluted not only by the type of food but by the very hands that cooked it. The Manusmriti details that food acceptably prepared by a Brahmin cook could become impure if even the shadow of an outcast or someone from a significantly lower caste fell upon it. The act of eating was itself a ritual, One had to bathe beforehand, wear clean clothes, eat while facing east, and never speak while food was in one's mouth. The leftovers of a meal were considered deeply polluted, and eating another person's leftovers was a profound mark of low status, expressly forbidden to the three upper castes. This entire system functioned as a powerful social engine. By making diet a matter of law, the Manusmriti created visible, everyday barriers between the castes. You couldn't easily share a meal with someone from a different social stratum, which drastically limited social interaction and intermingling. It baked inequality into the most fundamental human experience, the need to eat, constantly reinforcing the hierarchy at every single meal. The plate became a map of the social order, and every bite was a reaffirmation of one's place within it. Moving from the rigid social hierarchies dictated by the Manusmriti, we find a legal system that approached justice with a completely different philosophy, one focused not on punishment or purity, but on precise, almost poetic balance. We journey now to the misty hills of early medieval Ireland, a land that had never been conquered by Rome and had developed its own unique and sophisticated legal tradition known as the Brehon laws. By the 7th century CE, these laws had been meticulously codified by professional jurists, and they reveal a society deeply concerned with fairness, compensation, and the minute details of daily life. And perhaps nothing illustrates the breathtaking intricacy of this system better than its statutes governing a creature we might think too small for legal consideration, the honeybee. The Brehon laws didn't just mention bees in passing. They featured an entire extensive section, a legal microcosm dedicated solely to apiculture, known as bechbretha or bee judgments. In a society where sugar was unknown, honey was an immensely valuable commodity. It was the only readily available sweetener, a crucial base for fermenting mead, the drink of nobility and celebration, and possessed medicinal properties. Therefore, the laws treated a beehive not as a simple object, but as a form of valuable, semi-autonomous livestock, and its produce was governed with astonishing precision. One of the most fascinating legal dilemmas the Brehon laws addressed was the issue of a bee swarm deciding to relocate. If your bees swarmed and flew to a neighbor's land to establish a new hive, who now owned them? Roman law might have simply declared finders keepers, but the Brehon system sought a far more nuanced and equitable solution. The laws created a sort of shared ownership based on the distance the swarm traveled. If the bees settled on a branch overhanging the property line, both landowners held a claim. The original owner retained rights to the swarm itself, while the landowner whose tree hosted the new hive was entitled to a share of the honey produced, a compensation for the use of his property. This recognized the labor of both parties, the initial care of the beekeeper and the provision of a home by the landowner. The laws even accounted for the bee's own nature. If a beekeeper's bees were known to be particularly aggressive and they flew out and stung a neighbor or their livestock to death, the beekeeper was held liable. The compensation was calculated with typical Brehon exactness based on the status of the victim. The fine for killing a chief through bee stings was of course far higher than that for a commoner. But the law also showed remarkable understanding. If the bees stung a person who had provoked them by throwing stones at the hive, the beekeeper owed no compensation. The system acknowledged that the victim had essentially brought the injury upon themselves. The true masterpiece of this legal framework was its formula for dividing a year's honey harvest. The Brehon lawyers developed a complex equation that would feel at home in a modern economics textbook. The total honey yield was divided into 3 symbolic shares. 1 share went to the land, 1 to the hive, and 1 to the beekeeper. In practice, this meant that if you owned the land but another man owned the hive and did the work of beekeeping, the harvest was split into thirds. The landowner received 1/3 for providing the location and the flowers. The beekeeper received 1/3 for his labor and skill, and the final third was set aside to replace the hive itself, viewed as a capital asset that would depreciate over time. This system ensured every contributor, the provider of resources, the provider of labor, and the provider of equipment, was fairly compensated, creating a powerful incentive for cooperation and investment in this vital industry. The Brehon laws on bees are a stunning example of a legal system that sought not to command and control, but to observe, understand, and balance the intricate web of relationships between people, property, and the natural world upon which they all depended. Yet, even as the Brehon lawyers were calculating the fair division of honey with such delicate precision, a powerful new empire was emerging in the deserts of Arabia, one that would build a system of market regulation so comprehensive it would stretch across 3 continents. In the early 8th century CE, the Umayyad Caliphate was at its zenith, governing a vast and incredibly diverse realm from the borders of China to the shores of Spain. With this immense territory came immense economic challenges, and it fell to a particularly pious and just ruler, Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, to address them. He enacted a series of reforms that revived and codified the Islamic concept of Hizbah, transforming it from a general religious injunction to command good and forbid evil into a formal, functioning government institution. This wasn't just a suggestion for merchants to be honest. It was the creation of the world's first comprehensive market inspection and consumer protection agency, and its standards were breathtakingly detailed. At the heart of the Hizbah system was a unique public official, the Mutazib. This was not a judge, a tax collector, or a police chief, but a hybrid of all 3, acting as the moral and economic conscience of the marketplace. Appointed by the Caliph himself, the Mutazib's duty was to patrol the souks and bazaars, not waiting for complaints but actively inspecting for fraud and misconduct. His authority was vast and his focus was laser-sharp. The most fundamental part of his job was the enforcement of honest weights and measures. He carried a set of certified weights and a carefully measured container, and he would routinely test the scales and measuring cups of every grain seller, oil merchant, and spice trader. If he found a merchant using underweight stones or a doctored scale, the punishment was swift and severe. Fines were common, but so was public shaming, which could be devastating in a close-knit commercial community. A fraudulent merchant might have his inaccurate weights confiscated and hung around his neck as he was paraded through the market, or he could be tied to the pillory at his own stall so every customer would know of his deceit. This public aspect of the punishment was crucial. It served as a powerful deterrent to others and restored trust in the entire marketplace. But the Mutazib's gaze went far beyond the scale. He was also the ancient world's most rigorous quality control officer. Islamic law, under Umar ibn Abdul Aziz's interpretation, established some of history's first product quality standards. A baker could not mix cheap barley flour into expensive wheat bread and sell it as pure. A butcher was forbidden from selling meat from a sick animal. A milk seller was prohibited from diluting his milk with water. The Mutazib was trained to spot these deceptions on sight, smell, and touch. He would inspect bread for its density and color, feel fabrics for their thread count and authenticity, and even check for hidden defects in pottery and metalwork. If a craftsman produced a shoddy product, the Mutazib could force him to repair it or refund the customer's money. This proactive approach to quality assurance protected consumers who had little recourse and ensured that the reputation of a city's goods remained high, which was essential for long-distance trade. Perhaps the most surprising and sophisticated aspect of this system was its approach to crises. Caliph Umar issued explicit decrees against price gouging during times of shortage, such as famines or droughts. However, this wasn't a simple, blunt force price freeze. The Mutazib understood basic economics. If merchants were forbidden from raising prices when goods were scarce, they would have no incentive to transport food to the stricken area, making the shortage even worse. So the law distinguished between different types of price increases. It was strictly illegal for a merchant who was already within the city to hoard an essential good like grain and then dramatically raise its price, exploiting the desperation of his neighbors. This was seen as predatory and immoral. However, if a merchant undertook the risk and expense of importing grain from another region to alleviate the shortage, he was permitted to sell it at a higher yet still reasonable market price. This delicate balance, punishing profiteering while encouraging supply, showed a remarkable level of economic sophistication. The mutazib's role was to judge the intent behind the price hike, ensuring that the market remained functional and life-saving goods continued to flow, all while protecting the poorest citizens from outright exploitation. This intricate system of market regulation, born in the 8th century, created a framework of trust that allowed Islamic commerce to flourish for centuries, building networks of trade that were renowned for their fairness and integrity from Cordoba to Baghdad. While the Umayyad Caliphate was building a sophisticated bureaucracy to police its marketplaces, a very different kind of legal order was thriving in the fjords and forests of the Viking world, one that achieved remarkable social control not through government inspectors but through the terrifying power of public opinion. In the Norse world, which stretched from Scandinavia to Iceland between the 8th and 11th centuries, there were no kings with vast administrative networks, no standing police forces, and certainly no prisons. Yet they maintained a complex and highly effective system of law, centered around a unique institution known as the Thing, or Assembly. This was the beating heart of Viking justice, a gathering of free men who would meet at a prescribed time and place, often a dramatic natural amphitheater, to debate disputes, witness oaths, and deliver judgments. And the most powerful, fearsome tool at their disposal was not a sentence of death or mutilation, but a declaration that stripped a person of all identity and protection, outlawry. To be declared an outlaw was to suffer a fate arguably worse than execution. The Old Norse term for it was skoganga, which literally means going into the forest. But this was no camping trip. It meant the individual was expelled from human society entirely. The law, as proclaimed by the unanimous voice of the assembly, declared them a vaga iacute veum, a wolf in the sacred places. This poetic phrase was chillingly literal. Like a wolf, the outlaw was no longer considered human. They were denied all legal rights and protections. Their property was confiscated, their inheritance rights were voided, and their marriage was dissolved. Most terrifyingly, the declaration made it legal for anyone to kill them on sight, without fear of reprisal or blood feud. In a society built on intricate laws of compensation for harm, the outlaw was placed entirely outside that system. Killing them was not a crime, it was pest control. The ceremony of declaring an outlaw was a dramatic public ritual designed to maximize its psychological impact. The proceedings at the Thing were steeped in formality and sacred gravity. The assembly met at a historically recognized site, often marked by a special ring of stones. The logsugumather, or law speaker, would preside, his role to recite the law from memory and ensure proper procedure was followed. Once a case was heard and a verdict of outlawry was reached, the pronouncement was not a mere formality. It was a performative act of magic. The law speaker or the chieftain who won the case would formally announce the judgment to the entire assembled community. This was often done in a specific, formulaic way, believed to channel the power of the gods and the collective will of the people. The act of speaking the words was thought to enact the change in the world, transforming a citizen into a wolf. In some accounts, the assembly would then make a great noise, shouting, clashing weapons, and beating shields, to symbolically drive the outlaw's spirit from the community and to warn the land itself of the dangerous creature now set loose upon it. This system of extreme social exclusion was perfectly adapted to the Viking world's geography and social structure. With vast, sparsely populated territories and no central authority to run prisons, incarceration was impossible. A physical punishment like execution could spark an endless cycle of blood feuds with the condemned person's family. Outlawry, however, was a brilliantly pragmatic solution. It removed the disruptive individual from society without the assembly having to spill blood directly, thereby avoiding the immediate trigger for vengeance. It placed the burden of enforcement on the entire community and the harshness of nature itself. An outlaw was forced to flee into the wilderness, to live in caves, steal for survival, and constantly be on the move, knowing that every human face they saw was a potential threat. They became a ghost erased from the social fabric. For a people whose identity was utterly bound to their kin group, their community, and their honor, this complete erasure of social existence was the ultimate punishment. It was a legal and social death that was often more feared than a quick physical one, proving that in the Viking mind, to be cast out from the company of men was a fate truly worse than death. This meticulous approach to justice finds a powerful echo in the legal philosophy of another ancient culture, one that also placed an immense value on human life and the perils of judicial error. Turning now to the world of 1st century Judea, we find a court system so cautious, so burdened with safeguards, that it was practically designed to avoid carrying out its most solemn duty. This was the Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish court of 71 sages in Jerusalem, and its procedures for capital cases were not about streamlining punishment, but about building a labyrinth of protections around the accused. In a time and place where Roman authority often executed with brutal efficiency, the rabbinical law, or halakha, created a parallel legal universe where a death sentence was the rarest of outcomes, a last resort so surrounded by hurdles that the court's very structure seemed to argue against its own power. The first and most formidable hurdle was the standard of evidence, which was set almost impossibly high. Roman law might accept circumstantial evidence or the testimony of a single witness, but the Sanhedrin demanded a degree of certainty that was extraordinarily difficult to achieve. The law required not one but two competent male eyewitnesses to the actual crime, and these couldn't be just any bystanders. Their testimony had to be perfectly aligned on every critical detail. They must have seen the entire act unfold with their own eyes from start to finish. They had to testify that they saw the accused person commit the crime, and crucially, they also had to testify that they saw the accused receive a formal warning immediately beforehand. This warning, called a hatra, was a unique and brilliant legal innovation. It wasn't enough for the witnesses to see the murder or the act of idolatry. They had to testify that another person, often one of the witnesses themselves, had confronted the would-be criminal on the spot. This person had to declare in clear language that the specific action they were about to commit was a capital offense under Jewish law, and they had to explicitly state what the punishment would be. The accused then had to acknowledge that they understood the warning and, astonishingly, verbally accept the consequences before proceeding anyway. This requirement transformed the legal definition of a crime. It wasn't just the physical act that mattered, it was the perpetrator's conscious, deliberate defiance of the law in the very moment of action. This made a conviction almost entirely dependent on a perpetrator who was not only guilty but also foolish enough to announce his intentions after a full legal briefing. The trial itself was a masterclass in skepticism designed to expose any flaw in the prosecution's case. The judges, who were all learned sages, acted not as neutral arbiters but as a de facto defense team. They were obligated to actively seek out any possible argument for acquittal. The witnesses were examined and cross-examined separately, and if their testimonies conflicted on even a minor detail, the color of a garment, the time of day, the type of weapon used, the entire case could be thrown out. The court would then vote, but it did so in a specific order designed to protect the accused. The youngest, most junior judges voted first. This prevented the older, more respected sages from influencing the junior members' opinions. If even one judge could articulate a reasonable doubt, the trial could be delayed while new arguments were considered. A conviction required a majority vote for guilt, but here's the catch. If every single judge voted guilty, the accused was automatically acquitted. The reasoning was breathtakingly humane. The rabbis argued that a unanimous verdict indicated a lack of proper defense. It suggested that the court had failed in its duty to find even a single advocate for the accused, rendering the trial a miscarriage of justice. This rule ensured that a capital case could never be a rubber stamp affair. It forced debate, dissent, and relentless scrutiny. Even if a defendant was convicted against all odds, the law erected one final, almost insurmountable barrier: time. A death sentence could never be carried out on the same day as the verdict. The court was required to adjourn for at least one full night. This waiting period was not for paperwork or appeals. It was a mandatory cooling-off period designed for profound introspection. The judges were sent away to fast and reflect on their decision. They were instructed to reconvene the next day and go through the entire case again from the beginning. During this second hearing, they were encouraged to change their votes from guilty to not guilty if any new doubt had crept into their minds overnight. The purpose was to ensure that the gravity of their decision had fully settled upon them, that they were acting from a place of solemn certainty, not the heat of debate. This practice recognized a deep psychological truth, that a decision to take a life, even a legally sanctioned one, should never be made in haste. It had to be slept on, agonized over, and reaffirmed in the cold light of a new day. The entire system, from the dual witness warning to the unanimous verdict rule to the mandatory wait, was a monumental expression of legal humility. It started from the core principle that it is better for 1,000 guilty people to go free than for a single innocent person to be wrongly executed. This rabbinical approach to capital punishment stands as one of the most sophisticated and humanely cautious legal philosophies of the ancient world, a powerful testament to the value placed on every single life. While the Sanhedrin's intricate legal process was designed to protect the individual from the power of the state, a revolutionary law on the other side of the world was reshaping society by redefining the very foundation of the family. Just a few centuries earlier, in 2nd century BC China, the newly established Han dynasty enacted a mandate that would have seemed utterly radical to most contemporary civilizations: the law of equal inheritance. This statute legally required that a father's property and wealth be divided equally among all of his sons, fundamentally dismantling the ancient and nearly universal practice of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the entire estate. In a single legislative stroke, the Han government sought to engineer a more fluid and merit-based society, but in doing so, it also planted the seeds for profound economic and social consequences that would ripple through Chinese history for centuries. To understand just how revolutionary this law was, we have to consider the power of primogeniture. From the feudal lords of Europe to the aristocratic families of Japan, the system of the firstborn son inheriting everything was the default setting for most advanced agrarian societies. The logic was straightforward. Keeping a family's landed wealth intact generation after generation ensured the preservation of its power, influence, and lineage. It prevented the endless subdivision of estates into smaller and smaller, and ultimately unsustainable plots of land. A noble house could remain a noble house for centuries under this system. The Han dynasty's equal inheritance law was a direct assault on this model of consolidated generational wealth. Its goal was to prevent the rise of a new, powerful landed aristocracy that could challenge the authority of the central imperial government, a lesson learned from the instability of the previous Qin era. By forcing the fragmentation of family fortunes, the law ensured that no single family could amass enough power over several generations to become a rival to the state. This policy was brilliantly aligned with the core tenets of Confucianism, which had been adopted as the state's ideological foundation. Confucian philosophy emphasized fairness, harmony, and the importance of the family unit. The law embodied the ideal of fairness among brothers, giving each son an equal stake in the family's legacy and an equal start in life. It was seen as a way to encourage fraternal duty and reduce the bitter squabbles that could erupt when one son was elevated far above the others. In theory, this created a powerful engine for social mobility. A younger son from a modestly wealthy family, who in another culture might have been forced into the military or the clergy for lack of prospects, now had a share of capital. He could use his inheritance to invest in education, sit for the imperial examinations, and secure a prestigious government post based on his own merit rather than his birth order. This system helped the Han dynasty cultivate a massive, loyal class of scholar officials whose authority came from the state itself, not from their families' inherited estates. However, the long-term unintended effects of this well-intentioned law were immense and in many ways created a cyclical pattern in Chinese history. With each passing generation, a family's land was subdivided again and again. A sizable estate that supported one family in one generation would be split among 4 or 5 sons in the next, and among 20 or 30 grandsons in the one after that. Within just a few generations, even the wealthiest families could see their holdings reduced to a collection of tiny, inefficient plots that could scarcely support a single family, let alone generate surplus wealth. This relentless fragmentation pushed countless families toward the brink of poverty and created intense pressure on the land. It became a primary driver behind the cycle of peasant rebellions that punctuate Chinese history. When a drought or a flood struck, these millions of smallholder farmers, each working a sliver of land, had no buffer against famine. Their desperation made them easy to rally behind rebel leaders promising land and food, leading to dynastic upheavals that would wipe the slate clean, only for the entire process to begin again under the new regime. The law also had a fascinating and somewhat paradoxical effect on the Chinese family structure. While it promoted fairness among brothers, it also placed extraordinary pressure on the imperative to have sons. Without a son, a family's lineage and property would effectively end. This intensified the cultural preference for male heirs and practices like concubinage, as a man would seek multiple partners to ensure he produced a son to carry on his name and receive a share of the estate. Furthermore, the knowledge that their future security depended on a fair division of the family wealth made brothers both partners and rivals. It encouraged a unique form of cooperation to see the overall family fortune grow. But it also sowed the potential for intense suspicion and conflict as each brother watched the others, ensuring no one received preferential treatment that could lead to a larger share of the eventual inheritance. The Han dynasty's equal inheritance mandate, therefore, stands as a stunning example of a law designed to solve one problem: the concentration of power while inadvertently creating another, the precariousness of economic stability. It reveals a sophisticated understanding of social engineering, but also a timeless lesson in the law of unintended consequences, showing how a policy meant to create fairness within the family could ultimately shape the destiny of an entire civilization. While the Han dynasty's inheritance laws reshaped family dynamics through economics, another empire on the other side of the world would enact a law that reshaped families through a far more direct and personal form of acquisition. In the 14th century, the nascent Ottoman Empire under Sultan Murad I established a legal institution so profound and so controversial that it would become the very backbone of their military and administrative power for centuries. This was the Devshirme system, a law that legally mandated the periodic conscription of young boys from Christian families living primarily in the Balkans. The term itself, meaning gathering or collecting, belies the immense personal and social upheaval it caused. Under this law, Ottoman officials would travel through villages in regions like Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and Greece, armed with the Sultan's authority to assess and select the most promising boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 15. The criteria were specific. They sought healthy, intelligent, and physically strong children. Often, they would prioritize sons from large families or those of noble but subjugated lineages, taking one boy from every 40 households. This was not a random abduction. It was a systematic, state-sanctioned harvest of human potential, executed with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. For the Christian families living under Ottoman rule, this law presented an agonizing paradox. On one hand, the arrival of the recruiting officer, or devshirmesi, was a moment of profound terror and grief. Families were legally compelled to surrender their sons, a directive enforced by the full power of the state. There are accounts of parents hiding their children in the forests or hurriedly arranging marriages for adolescent boys to make them ineligible. Some even resorted to maiming a son's finger to render him physically imperfect and thus unsuitable for selection. The pain of this separation was absolute. These boys were taken from their homes, their language, their religion, and their families, often never to see them again. They were marched to Istanbul, where they would undergo a rigorous process of conversion to Islam, receive Turkish names, and be cut off entirely from their past lives. From the perspective of these Balkan communities, the devshirme was a blood tax, a brutal reminder of their subjugated status, and a relentless drain on their most vital resource, their children. Yet, from the perspective of the Ottoman state and for the boys themselves, the system offered a path to power and prestige that was almost unimaginable in the rigid feudal structures of contemporary Europe. This was the genius and the dark allure of the devshirme. Upon arrival in the capital, the most intellectually gifted boys were selected for education in the palace school. They would be taught mathematics, science, literature, theology, and the art of war, immersed in the complexities of Ottoman statecraft and Islamic culture. They were being groomed not as mere soldiers, but as future governors, admirals, and grand viziers, the highest-ranking officials in the entire empire, second only to the Sultan himself. The others would enter the military corps, undergoing the famously harsh training that would forge them into the janissaries, the elite infantry that formed the empire's most formidable military unit. These were not slaves in the chattel sense. They were kull, or servants of the porte, considered legally to be the Sultan's personal slaves, which in Ottoman context was a position of immense privilege and trust. This created a unique form of social engineering. The devshirme supplied the Ottoman state with a ruling class that was entirely dependent on the Sultan's favor, with no competing loyalties to Turkish noble families, tribal clans, or hereditary aristocracies that could challenge the throne. A grand vizier who was a devshirme recruit had no power base outside the system that created him. His authority flowed entirely from the Sultan, making him supremely loyal. For the boys, it was a terrifying but unparalleled opportunity for upward mobility. A peasant's son from a remote Macedonian village could, through his own merit and the state's investment, rise to command armies, govern vast provinces, and wield power that dwarfed that of any European king's most trusted noble. Their pasts were erased not just to sever old ties, but to create a new, unified identity centered solely on service to the empire and the Sultan. The Janissary Corps itself became a fiercely proud institution, with its own distinctive customs, music, and hierarchy, bound together by this shared, transformative origin story. The devshirme law, therefore, was a brutal, heartbreaking mechanism that simultaneously represented the ultimate oppression for conquered peoples and the ultimate meritocracy for the individuals it seized, a stark contradiction that powered one of history's most enduring and powerful empires. While the Ottomans were building an empire by taking sons from their families, an empire on the other side of the world was enforcing a law that dictated what its citizens could and could not put into their own bodies, with the most severe consequences imaginable. We now cross the Atlantic to the heart of the Aztec Empire in the 15th century, to the magnificent island city of Tenochtitlan, a marvel of canals and towering temples. Here, order was maintained by a complex legal code, and one of its most surprising and strictly enforced statutes concerned the consumption of alcohol, or octli. For the common Aztec citizen, public drunkenness was not a minor offense. It was a capital crime, punishable by death. The law was shockingly unequivocal. If a commoner was caught drunk and disorderly in public, they could be dragged to the temple steps and have their head crushed with a club. This extreme penalty reveals a society grappling with a substance it considered both sacred and dangerously destabilizing. To understand this draconian law, we must first let go of our modern view of alcohol as mere recreation. For the Aztecs, the fermented sap of the maguey plant was deeply intertwined with the divine. It was the sacred beverage of gods like Mayahul, the goddess of the maguey, and was an essential element in certain religious ceremonies, particularly those dedicated to the pulp gods who governed fertility and agricultural abundance. Priests and elderly statesmen were permitted to drink it during these rituals, and it was sometimes given to sacrificial victims to ease their passage to the next world. In this context, alcohol was not a tool for getting drunk. It was a sacrament, a means of communing with the gods. For an ordinary person to consume it for mere pleasure was seen as a form of sacrilege, a grotesque parody of a holy rite. It was stealing the power of the gods and using it for base, earthly gratification, an act that could anger the deities and bring misfortune upon the entire community. Beyond the spiritual violation, the Aztec state had immensely pragmatic reasons for this zero-tolerance policy. Tenochtitlan was a densely populated, meticulously organized city. Its survival depended on a highly disciplined workforce of farmers, artisans, and laborers. Public drunkenness led to idleness, missed work, and neglected fields, which directly threatened the city's food supply and economic output. Perhaps even more importantly, alcohol-fueled arguments could easily escalate into violence, disrupting the delicate social harmony and potentially sparking feuds between Calpolis, the city's kin-based districts. In an empire maintained through military might and constant tribute, internal stability was paramount. A drunk and belligerent citizen was not just a nuisance, they were a potential spark that could ignite a wider conflict, undermining the authority of the Tlatoni, the emperor, and the rigid social structure that held the empire together. The death penalty was a brutal but effective deterrent, a stark reminder that individual indulgence would not be tolerated at the expense of the collective good. However, this harsh standard was not applied equally to all. The law exhibited a stark double standard that perfectly mirrored the Aztecs' rigid social hierarchy. While a commoner faced execution, a member of the nobility, a pile caught in the same offense, would typically receive a far more lenient punishment. Their hair would be shorn, a public mark of shame that would grow back, and they might be exiled from the city for a period or have their noble house demolished. This disparity was rooted in the Aztec concept of tecatlatl, the idea that nobles were inherently more disciplined and carried a greater burden of responsibility. Their education and breeding were believed to grant them superior self-control. A noble's drunkenness was therefore seen as a temporary lapse in judgment, a failure to live up to a high standard, but not an inherent threat to the social order. A commoner's drunkenness, by contrast, was viewed as evidence of a weak, undisciplined character and a direct threat to the stability the state worked so hard to maintain. This legal distinction ensured that the ruling class maintained its privilege and aura of superiority, even in their transgressions. The Aztec laws on drunkenness, therefore, were more than just sumptuary regulations. They were a powerful tool of social control, enforcing religious piety, economic productivity, and the unchallenged authority of the state and its elite, all under the ever-watchful eyes of the gods. High in the Andes Mountains, the Inca Empire mastered the art of state control, building a vast and powerful civilization without the wheel, without a written language, and without money as we know it. Their extraordinary success was built on a single, unshakable principle. Every single subject was a resource of the state, and every resource had to be managed with maximum efficiency. This philosophy extended to the most intimate aspects of life, leading to one of history's most comprehensive and surprising social engineering projects, a law that made marriage mandatory for every man and woman by the age of 20. This was not a suggestion or a cultural expectation. It was a state directive as integral to the Inca administrative system as the quipu, the intricate knotted cords used for record keeping. The Sapa Inca, the divine ruler, was considered the owner of all land and all people. His government's primary task was to ensure the empire's stability, which required a steady and predictable labor force for its massive agricultural terraces, its monumental construction projects, and its powerful army. The mandatory marriage law was the key to guaranteeing that labor force never dwindled. By legally compelling the formation of new family units, the state was, in effect, commissioning the production of the next generation of taxpayers and workers. For most young people in the empire, the process was straightforward. Communities were tightly knit, and young men and women often found their own partners. Their union would be recognized at a local ceremony, and they would be allotted their share of land from the communal fields to farm. However, for those who reached the age of 20 without a spouse, the state's intricate bureaucracy swung into action. Local officials, known as curakas, were responsible for the well-being and productivity of their village. A key part of their duty was to ensure everyone was married. These officials would therefore arrange marriages for any remaining singles, pairing them based on practical considerations that served the community's needs. The preferences or romantic desires of the individuals were secondary to the overarching goal of creating a viable, productive household unit. The brilliance of this system was its seamless integration with the Inca's economic model. The empire did not collect taxes in coin, it collected labor. This system was called mita, a rotational labor tax. Every household owed a certain amount of work to the state, each year building roads, weaving cloth for the army, mining or farming the state's lands. A married couple constituted a single tax unit. They worked their allotted plot of land together to feed themselves and their children, and they fulfilled their mita obligations together. A single person, by contrast, was an administrative anomaly, an unassigned labor unit that was not contributing to its full potential. Marriage created the fundamental economic building block of the empire. It stabilized the workforce, ensured a continuous supply of new laborers through childbirth, and made the complex system of resource allocation and labor distribution infinitely easier for the imperial accountants to manage. This law also provided a crucial social safety net. By guaranteeing everyone a partner and a plot of land, the state ensured that no one would be left without means of support, which in turn prevented vagrancy and begging. It fostered community cohesion and reinforced the Inca's collectivist ideology, where the needs of the empire always trumped individual desire. While it might seem incredibly intrusive to our modern sense of personal freedom, for the Inca, this mandate was a sacred duty. It was how a citizen contributed to the strength and eternal glory of the Tahuantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. The law transformed the deeply personal act of marriage into a civic function, weaving the threads of individual lives directly into the unwavering fabric of the state. Moving from the collective obligations of the Inca state, we arrive at a law that exposes the deeply personal and legal vulnerability of women in the ancient world. Carved into the stones of a public wall in the city of Gortyn on the island of Crete, a legal code from the 5th century BC stands as one of the most detailed and revealing documents from ancient Greece. Among its extensive regulations on debt, inheritance, and marriage, we find a statute dealing with sexual violence that is shocking to the modern conscience, not for its brutality, but for its cold, transactional nature. The Gortyn Code did not treat rape as a violent crime against a woman's bodily autonomy. Instead, it was categorized explicitly as a property crime, an offense against the man under whose legal authority she lived. The law is meticulously specific. If a free man raped a free woman in the house of her father or her husband, the perpetrator was required to pay 100 staters, a significant sum of silver, to the male head of that household. If the assault occurred elsewhere, the fine was cut in half to 50 staters. If the victim was not a free citizen but the enslaved property of another man, the fine was reduced drastically to just 5 staters for an assault in the house and 2 for one outside. The calculus of justice was based entirely on location and status, with no consideration for the woman's experience or trauma. Her body was not her own in the eyes of the law. It was an asset, and its violation was a form of damages, akin to trespassing on another man's land or injuring his livestock. The compensation was not for her. It was for the diminishment of her value to the man who owned her legal rights. This legal framework was a direct reflection of the Greek concept of the Kyrios or guardian. Every woman from childhood to old age was permanently under the legal control of a man, first her father, then her husband, and if she was widowed, a son or another male relative. She could not represent herself in court, enter into significant contracts, or own property in her own right. Her primary value to the oikos or household was her potential for marriage and the production of legitimate heirs. A rape could severely damage this value. If the victim was unmarried, the crime could render her unmarriageable, as she would no longer be considered a virgin, a prerequisite for a respectable Greek bride. If she was married, the violation was an insult to her husband's honor and a threat to the legitimacy of his bloodline, as any pregnancy resulting from the assault would create doubt about the paternity of his children. The law at Gorton was designed to financially compensate the Kyrios for this economic and social loss. What the code reveals is a society that viewed women not as individuals with inherent rights, but as conduits of social and economic relationships between men. The law's primary concern was maintaining the stability of these relationships and the clear lines of inheritance. This is why the statute includes specific provisions for what happens if the rapist himself is a slave. In that case, the law demanded a double payment, but not to the victim. The fine was paid to the slave's master, who was considered liable for the actions of his human property. The woman, once again, was a bystander in the legal resolution of a crime committed against her own body. The Gorton Code, for all its sophistication in other areas, offers a stark window into a world where a woman's personhood was legally invisible, her suffering irrelevant to the scales of justice, which were calibrated only to measure the honor and property of men. While the Gorton Code reduced a woman's body to mere property in the eyes of the law, another civilization was using clothing to construct an entire visible map of its social order. We now travel back in time and eastward to the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, to the powerful Middle Assyrian Empire of the 15th century BCE. Here, a series of laws were inscribed on clay tablets that governed society with an iron fist, and among them were statutes that wielded fabric as a tool of control. The Middle Assyrian laws contained some of history's most explicit and detailed sumptuary codes, but they went far beyond regulating luxury. They engineered social hierarchy itself through mandatory veiling. This wasn't about religious modesty as we might understand it today. It was a legal system of identification where a woman's head covering publicly announced her sexual and social status to every person she passed. The law, specifically Tablet A, Law 40, is breathtakingly precise in its segregation. It legally mandated that married, free-born Assyrian women must wear a veil when they were out in public. This veil was not a suggestion, it was her badge of honor and her legal obligation. It signaled that she was a respectable woman under the protection and authority of her husband. To appear in public without it was a severe transgression, but the law's true complexity is revealed in its distinctions. Concubines who accompanied their mistresses in public were also required to be veiled, a mark of their connection to a powerful household. However, if a concubine was sent out on an errand alone, the law demanded she be unveiled. This seemingly minor detail was a crucial legal marker. It prevented a concubine from impersonating the status of a free wife when outside the direct supervision of the household, ensuring the social hierarchy was never blurred in the public eye. The most severe and revealing distinctions were reserved for the bottom of the social ladder. Prostitutes and enslaved women were expressly forbidden from veiling. The law stated that any woman who was not a respectable wife or a designated concubine must have her head uncovered. To enforce this, the statutes prescribed brutal public punishments for violations. If a prostitute was caught wearing a veil, any citizen was legally empowered to seize her, bring her before the city authorities, and have her publicly flogged with 50 blows. The punishment didn't end with physical pain. The person who arrested her was entitled to a reward of lead or some other valuable material taken from her clothing, and they could also pour hot tar over her head, a permanent, humiliating mark of her crime and her station. The law even punished those who might try to help a slave girl rise above her station. If a man knowingly allowed a veiled prostitute or slave to pass without denouncing her, he himself could be flogged, fined, and forced into labor for the king. This system of legally enforced dress code served two powerful purposes for the Assyrian state. The first was the maintenance of a rigid, visible social hierarchy. In a crowded marketplace or street, anyone could instantly identify a woman's place in the world simply by glancing at her head. This eliminated any ambiguity and reinforced class boundaries at every moment of public life. It ensured that a slave could never be mistaken for a free woman, protecting the privileges of the elite from any form of inadvertent social contamination. The second, and perhaps more profound purpose, was the state-controlled regulation of female sexuality and its availability to men. By reserving the veil for respectable wives, the law marked them as off-limits, the protected property of their husbands. Conversely, by forcing prostitutes and slaves to go unveiled, the law effectively marked them as sexually available and outside the protection afforded to married women. It was a system that legally sanctioned and organized the exploitation of lower-class women while fiercely guarding the sexual exclusivity of upper-class wives. This transformed the veil from a simple piece of cloth into a powerful legal instrument. It wasn't about a woman's piety or personal choice. It was a government-issued tag that displayed her owner's status and controlled access to her body, making the streets of an Assyrian city a living, breathing diagram of social power and sexual control. Yet, even as the Assyrians used veiling laws to construct a rigid social order, another ancient civilization would use sumptuary legislation to enforce a very different kind of austerity, targeting not just status, but the very soul of the republic during a time of existential crisis. We arrive now in the 3rd century BCE, in the heart of the Roman Republic, a state locked in a life or death struggle against its greatest rival, the Carthaginian general Hannibal. The Second Punic War was bleeding Rome dry, both in manpower and treasure. It was in this atmosphere of collective sacrifice and pervasive fear that the Roman state passed one of its most infamous and controversial laws, the Lex Oppia. Proposed by the tribune Gaius Oppius in 215 BC, this was not a mere guideline. It was a severe set of restrictions specifically aimed at the women of Rome. The law forbade any woman from possessing more than half an ounce of gold, from wearing a dress dyed with multiple colors, and from riding in a carriage within the city of Rome or any town within a mile of it, unless she was attending a public religious festival. To understand the sheer impact of the Lex Oppia, we have to visualize the Roman elite woman it targeted. Before the war, a wealthy matron might have owned intricate gold jewelry, a family heirloom passed down through generations. She might have worn a stunning stola, the dress of a respectable married woman, dyed a brilliant saffron yellow or a rich crimson using expensive pigments imported from the East. And she would have traveled through the crowded, muddy streets of Rome in a litter or a carriage, a practical necessity to keep her clean and a visible symbol of her family's rank. The Lex Oppia, in one sweeping motion, stripped all of this away. Overnight, her cherished gold was limited to a single, simple ring. Her wardrobe was reduced to plain, undyed woolens. Her mobility was curtailed, forcing her to walk through the same grime as the common people. This was a profound and very public demotion in status, a forced embrace of a Spartan simplicity that was meant to be shared by all citizens for the good of the state. The official justification for the law was squarely rooted in the wartime economy. The state needed every available resource to fund the legions. Precious metals were required to mint coins to pay soldiers. Expensive dyes, often imported from Phoenician territories now under Carthaginian influence, were a drain on scarce foreign currency. Horses and vehicles suitable for carriages were desperately needed for military transport and logistics. The law framed female luxury not as a personal choice, but as a direct threat to national security. A woman wearing a multi-colored dress was, in the eyes of the law, quite literally wearing a military defeat. Her comfort was seen as an unaffordable indulgence while Roman men were dying on battlefields hundreds of miles away. The law was presented as a necessary sacrifice, a way for the women of Rome to contribute materially and symbolically to the war effort, demonstrating a unity of purpose that would please the gods and strengthen the resolve of the men fighting. However, the true, unspoken motive of the Lex Oppia ran much deeper, touching a raw nerve in the patriarchal heart of Roman society. The law was as much about controlling female economic independence as it was about conserving resources. When Hannibal annihilated the Roman legions at Cannae in 216 BC, he killed tens of thousands of men, many of them from the propertied classes. This catastrophe suddenly left a significant number of women as widows and heiresses, in control of vast family fortunes. For the conservative Roman male aristocracy, this was a terrifying prospect. A wealthy widow was a dangerous anomaly. She could operate with a degree of financial autonomy that challenged the absolute authority of a paterfamilias. She could choose not to remarry, or worse, she could marry a man of her own choosing, potentially diverting a family's wealth to a rival clan. The Lex Oppia was a brilliantly cynical tool to curb this newfound power. By limiting the visible display of wealth, the law effectively curtailed a woman's ability to signal her social and financial capital. It hampered her ability to navigate society independently and negotiate from a position of strength. It was a legal reminder that even in the absence of a husband or father, a woman's wealth and status were not truly her own to flaunt. They were still subject to the approval and regulation of the male-dominated state. The law aimed to keep these newly powerful women in their traditional place, ensuring that even in a crisis that turned the world upside down, the fundamental hierarchy of Roman society remained firmly intact. While the Inca and Aztec empires used laws to control the bodies and labor of their citizens, and the Romans legislated female austerity, an ancient Indian political mastermind was crafting a legal framework to govern something far more shadowy, the invisible army of the state. Around 320 BCE, as Chandragupta Maurya was forging a vast empire across the Indian subcontinent, his chief advisor, the brilliant and ruthless strategist Kautilya, was composing the Arthashastra. This was not merely a philosophical treatise, it was a detailed manual on statecraft, an encyclopedia of realpolitik that covered everything from economics and foreign policy to law and administration. And within its pages, Kautilya dedicated entire chapters to codifying the most secretive arm of the government, its network of spies, assassins, and secret agents. The Arthashastra didn't just suggest using espionage, it created a comprehensive legal and bureaucratic system to manage it, granting spies both immense power and surprising legal protections for their dark work. Kautilya's system was stunningly sophisticated. He categorized spies into specific, specialized roles, each with a defined legal status and mission. There were Sansthas, undercover agents planted in the courts of rival kings, and Sancharas, roaming spies who gathered intelligence from the countryside. Some agents, known as tictioners, were specialists in assassination and sabotage, while satrists were double agents meant to infiltrate enemy spy rings. But the most fascinating agents were the eudasthetes, the apostates or revolutionaries. These were deep-cover operatives who would establish entire fake lives, often for years at a time. They might pose as heretical monks preaching a new doctrine to destabilize a region, or as disgraced nobles seeking revenge against the Mauryan state, all to gain the trust of genuine dissidents and draw them into a trap. The Arthashastra provided legal cover for these operatives to commit what would normally be considered serious crimes. An agent posing as a criminal to infiltrate a gang was legally immune from prosecution for the minor offenses he had to commit to maintain his cover. This was a revolutionary concept, the state legally sanctioning certain illegal acts in the name of a greater security objective. The most startling legal protections, however, were reserved for agents engaged in wetwork assassination. Cordelia outlined a chillingly precise set of rules for the elimination of threats. If a foreign king or a domestic rebel leader was deemed an imminent danger to the state, the Arthashastra authorized their targeted killing. But this wasn't a license for random murder, it was a regulated process. The text details various methods, from poisoning a meal to deploying a hidden weapon, but it always emphasized the preferred outcome. The death should appear accidental or from natural causes to avoid sparking a war or a martyr's rebellion. Crucially, the law protected the assassin. If an agent was captured in the act, the Mauryan state was legally obligated to disavow any knowledge of him. He was on his own. However, if he succeeded and escaped, he was guaranteed a significant reward, a grant of land, a generous pension, or a high-ranking official position. His family was also provided for by the state, ensuring their well-being even if he was killed. This system of rewards and deniability created a powerful incentive for these shadow warriors, balancing the immense risk of their missions with the promise of immense reward and a form of posthumous care that acknowledged their service. This legal framework extended beyond individual actions to grand campaigns of deception. The Arthashastra legally authorized the use of vichara, or strategic misinformation, as a tool of state policy. An entire class of spies, known as Vyanjanas, were specialists in forgery and disinformation. They might create fake letters from a rival king's general suggesting treason, or spread rumors of a plague in an enemy city to cause panic and economic flight. The law protected these agents from charges of slander or fraud, as their lies were considered acts of war, not personal malfeasance. The text even provides guidelines for what we would now call psychological operations, suggesting agents spread songs and ballads among the enemy's population that praised the Mauryan emperor while subtly highlighting the weaknesses of their own ruler. This was seen as a legal and legitimate way to soften up a target before a military campaign, making the eventual conquest easier and less bloody. Cordelia's genius was in recognizing that information itself was a battlefield, and he gave his spies the legal tools to wage war on that front. The Arthashastra, therefore, stands as a breathtakingly early and sophisticated example of a state attempting to bring law into the lawless world of espionage, creating a system where the most morally ambiguous acts of power were not left to chance or whim, but were carefully regulated, rewarded, and integrated into the very machinery of government. While the Arthashastra legally sanctioned the shadowy work of human spies, a very different legal tradition was extending the full force of the law to defendants who could not speak, understand the charges against them, or even comprehend the concept of a trial. This brings us to a practice that seems to us like a surreal parody of justice, the medieval animal trial. Across Europe, but most famously in the legal traditions of the Saxons and other Germanic peoples, we find meticulous court records detailing the arrest, prosecution, condemnation, and public execution of animals for crimes ranging from murder to destruction of property. These were not mob lynchings or superstitious rituals. They were formal judicial proceedings conducted with all the solemnity of a human trial. A pig that mauled an infant would be arrested, placed in a jail cell, assigned a legal advocate, and brought before a court of law to answer for its crimes. If found guilty, it would be sentenced to death, often by hanging or burning, carried out by the official executioner at the public gallows. The level of procedural detail is staggering. In one famous 1440 case in Savigny, France, a sot was convicted of murdering a child and was sentenced to be hanged. Records show the executioner was paid for his services, and he was also paid for a new pair of gloves, a grisly perquisite meant to signify the cleanliness of his official duty. The logic behind these trials feels alien because it rests on a worldview fundamentally different from our own. Medieval Europeans did not see a sharp divide between the human and natural worlds. Theirs was a universe permeated by spiritual forces, where every creature, from the highest king to the lowliest insect, was a participant in a grand, divinely ordained order. An animal that committed a violent act was not seen as a mindless beast acting on instinct. Instead, it was believed to be a moral agent, capable of understanding right and wrong, and of making a conscious choice to rebel against the natural law established by God. A pig that ate a child was not just dangerous, it was evil, possessed by a demonic force or acting out its own wicked will. Therefore, it couldn't simply be put down as a public health hazard. It had to be formally tried, found guilty, and executed to purge the community of that spiritual corruption. The trial and punishment were a form of collective exorcism, a ritual to restore the moral and cosmic balance that the animal's crime had disrupted. This belief in animal moral agency even extended to insects and pests. There are numerous records of communities bringing lawsuits against rats, mice, and locusts for the crime of destroying crops. In these cases, the animals were often summoned to appear in court, and when they inevitably failed to show up, the court would appoint a legal defender to plead their case. The defense might argue that the animals were simply following their God-given nature to eat, or that the humans had not been good stewards of the land. In one remarkable 16th century case in St. Julien, France, vineyard workers brought a lawsuit against a swarm of beetles that were devouring their grapes. The local bishop presided over the case, and the beetles were assigned a lawyer who argued they had as much right to sustenance as the humans. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the vineyard workers and issued a formal decree of excommunication against the beetles, ordering them to leave the area. This wasn't merely a superstitious curse, it was a legal judgment delivered with the full authority of the church, and it was believed to be legally and spiritually binding. The ceremony involved prayers, processions, and the ringing of bells to drive the creatures out, treating them as sentient beings who could understand and were obligated to obey the law. Beyond the spiritual cleansing, these trials served a crucial social function. In an age without modern forensic science or social services, the death of a child or the destruction of a harvest was a traumatic event that could easily fracture a community. Grief and fear could quickly turn into suspicion and blame, leading to accusations of witchcraft against a neighbor or a violent pogrom against a minority group. The animal trial provided a structured, legal outlet for this collective trauma. By funneling the community's anger and desire for justice into a formal legal process against a non-human defendant, it offered a cathartic, publicly sanctioned resolution. Everyone could agree that the guilty pig was the culprit, and watching it be executed provided a sense of closure and the restoration of order. It prevented human bloodshed and social chaos, acting as a bizarre but effective form of societal safety valve. The animal trial, for all its apparent absurdity, reveals a society struggling to impose human concepts of order, reason, and justice onto a chaotic and often cruel natural world, using the familiar tools of the law to confront the incomprehensible. While the medieval world was putting animals on trial and the Inca state was arranging mandatory marriages, one of the most powerful women in history was using her authority to utterly transform the lives of thousands of women in her own city. crafting a law that was as much about economic empowerment as it was about morality. In the 6th century Byzantine capital of Constantinople, the great Emperor Justinian was not the only ruler issuing groundbreaking decrees. His wife, Empress Theodora, launched one of the most ambitious and surprising social reform programs in antiquity, a series of laws that effectively banned prostitution in the city and provided a tangible path out of the trade for the women who practiced it. This was not a simple moral crackdown from an aloof ruler. Theodora's policy was deeply personal, and to understand its revolutionary nature, we must first understand her own extraordinary journey. Theodora was not born into the purple of the imperial palace. Early historians, particularly the scandalized Procopius in his Secret History, describe her beginnings in the gritty world of Constantinople's hippodrome and theater district. She was an actress, a profession that in the Byzantine world was virtually synonymous with courtesan. She performed in mimes that were often ribald and offensive to the pious, and she reportedly lived a life of notorious glamour and notoriety before undergoing a profound religious conversion. She abandoned her old life, embraced a pious form of Christianity, and remarkably caught the eye of the future emperor Justinian. Their marriage caused an uproar among the old aristocracy, but Justinian, deeply in love, changed ancient laws to allow former actresses to marry into the senatorial class, clearing the way for Theodora to become his co-ruler, not just his consort. She was crowned Augusta, and she wielded power with an intelligence and ruthlessness that matched his own, famously persuading him to stay and fight during the Nika riots when he was ready to flee, a decision that saved his throne. Theodora never forgot where she came from. She had seen firsthand the precariousness of a woman's life in the city, the exploitation, the disease, and the dead-end nature of the sex trade. Her laws, therefore, were crafted not from a place of judgment but of profound empathy. She didn't just want to clear the streets of what the church considered sin. She wanted to dismantle the system that created the sin. Her first act was to order the immediate closure of all the brothels in Constantinople. But this is where her policy diverges from every other simple prohibition in history. She knew that simply shutting the doors would achieve nothing but pushing the trade underground and leaving thousands of women destitute and even more vulnerable. So she paired the ban with a comprehensive state-funded support system. On the shores of the Asiatic side of the Bosporus, directly across from the splendors of the Great Palace, stood a magnificent former palace known as the Metanoia, or Repentance. Theodora confiscated this vast complex and converted it into a sanctuary, a convent-like retreat specifically for former prostitutes. Here, women were offered not just a roof over their heads, but a complete life overhaul. They were given secure housing, food, medical care, and an education. Most importantly, they were taught a viable trade. Theodora understood that economic independence was the only true path to freedom. The women in the Metanoia learned to spin wool and weave cloth, skills that were always in high demand and could provide a respectable and steady income. After a period of training and acclimation, they were free to leave, equipped with the means to support themselves honorably, or they could choose to take vows and remain in the community permanently. The state provided a dowry for those who wished to marry, removing the economic pressure that had forced many into the trade in the first place. Theodora's law was a stunningly modern fusion of moral vision and practical welfare. It recognized that you cannot legislate morality through punishment alone. You must also provide a viable and dignified alternative. It was one of the earliest examples of a state recognizing the economic underpinnings of social issues and attempting to address them with compassion and resources, a legacy of radical empathy carved into law by an empress who had lived it herself. Imagine making a mistake at work and the penalty wasn't just a warning from your boss, but a legal mandate to have your hand cut off. For physicians in ancient Egypt, the stakes of their profession could not have been higher. While other civilizations were legislating hairstyles and livestock, the Egyptians were pioneering a concept that would take millennia to become standard practice: medical malpractice liability. Around 1800 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, the legal codes carved into Egyptian temples included some of the most sophisticated medical regulations ever conceived. These laws were built on a simple yet revolutionary principle: a physician must be held accountable for the outcomes of their treatments, but this accountability was not one size fits all. It was meticulously calibrated to the rigid social hierarchy of Egyptian society, creating a multi-tiered system of justice for the healing arts. The law was startlingly precise in its application of penalties. If a physician performed a surgical procedure on a free-born Egyptian citizen, a member of the elite class, and the patient died or suffered severe harm, the consequences were dire. The physician could be found guilty of negligence and sentenced to the loss of his hand. This brutal punishment was symbolic as much as it was practical. The hand that failed in its duty was the very instrument that was forfeit, ensuring that the physician would never practice again and serving as a stark, public warning to others in his profession. However, if the exact same procedure, performed with the exact same unsuccessful outcome, was conducted on a commoner or a slave, the penalty was completely different. Instead of a physical mutilation, the physician was required to provide financial compensation to the patient or, in the case of death, to the patient's owner. He might be ordered to provide a new slave to replace the one he had killed, or to pay a fine equivalent to the value of the injured party. This distinction reveals a cold, hard truth about Egyptian law: the value of a life was not equal. The state placed a higher value on the well-being of its aristocratic citizens, and a mistake that cost one of them their life was an offense against the social order itself, punishable by maiming. A mistake that cost a slave their life, however, was treated as a simple matter of property damage, rectified through economic restitution. While this seems horrifically unjust to our modern sensibilities, within the context of ancient Egypt, it created a powerful incentive structure. It forced physicians to be exceptionally cautious and thorough when treating high-status patients, effectively ensuring that the most valuable members of society received the absolute best care available. The law essentially mandated a higher standard of care for the elite, a concept that, while ethically flawed, was brutally logical for its time. But these malpractice laws did more than just punish failure. They actively fostered excellence and innovation. The constant threat of severe penalty compelled physicians to adopt rigorous practices that would protect them in court. This led to two major advancements that would shape the future of medicine. First, it necessitated the creation of detailed medical documentation. Before undertaking a risky procedure, especially on a noble, a physician would meticulously document the patient's condition, the proposed treatment, and the potential risks. This written record, often copied onto papyrus and stored in temple archives, served as a legal defense. It proved the physician had followed established protocols and had obtained what we would now call informed consent. This practice of documentation transformed medicine from a mystical art into a more empirical science, creating a written body of knowledge that could be studied and improved upon by future generations. Second, the system encouraged specialization and the development of standardized treatments. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest known surgical treatises, reads less like a book of spells and more like a modern medical textbook. It describes 48 different injuries and ailments, each with a structured entry: the title of the case, the examination procedure, the diagnosis, a prognosis declaring whether the condition was treatable, contended with, or not to be treated, and finally, the prescribed treatment. This level of standardization was a direct result of a legal environment that demanded proven, repeatable methods. A physician could defend his actions by pointing to a specific case in a revered papyrus scroll and demonstrating that he had followed the accepted procedure to the letter. The ancient Egyptian malpractice laws, therefore, were not merely about punishment. They were a sophisticated, if severe, mechanism for quality control. They protected patients from quackery, incentivized physicians towards precision and careful study, and laid the foundational principles of medical ethics, documentation, and standardized practice that remain the cornerstones of modern medicine today. From the meticulous price controls of ancient to the life-altering social engineering of the Inca Empire, these 30 laws offer us so much more than a simple list of historical oddities. They form a mosaic of human civilization, a breathtakingly diverse tapestry of legal thinking that reveals the core values, the deepest fears, and the most ingenious innovations of our ancestors. What unites a law punishing a builder for a collapsed house with one mandating a daily beer ration for a pyramid worker? They are both born from a fundamental desire to impose order on the chaos of human existence, to forge stability and predictability in a world full of uncertainty. Each statute, whether bizarre or brutal, compassionate or calculating, was a tool designed to solve a specific problem, whether that problem was a dangerous animal, an unstable market, a rebellious population, or a threat to the cosmic balance. These ancient codes show us that law was never just about right and wrong in a simple sense. It was a multifaceted instrument used for economic management, like the fixed prices in Mesopotamia or the sophisticated market inspections of the Umayyad Caliphate. It was a mechanism for social control, brutally evident in the Assyrian veiling laws or the Spartan marriage mandates that turned personal relationships into affairs of state. It was a means of spiritual cleansing, as seen in the Hittite animal trials or the Aztec prohibitions on public drunkenness, and sometimes, as with Ashoka's animal welfare edicts or Theodora's compassionate rehabilitation of women, it was a vehicle for profound empathy and a radical vision of a more merciful world. The sheer variety proves there has never been one single path to justice, order, or societal structure. Each civilization, shaped by its environment, its beliefs, and its challenges, crafted a legal system that was a unique reflection of its own soul. This journey through antiquity challenges our modern assumptions and forces us to see the past not as a monolith, but as a complex and often contradictory conversation about how humans should live together. It reminds us that our own laws, which we often take for granted as natural and inevitable, are themselves the products of a long and winding historical evolution built upon the successes and failures of these ancient experiments. The next time you read a news article about a new regulation or engage in a debate about justice, remember that you are participating in a discussion that is thousands of years old, one that has involved Sumerian merchants, Egyptian physicians, Roman senators, and Byzantine empresses. History is not a dead subject, it is the living foundation of our present. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these ancient laws did you find the most surprising, the most shocking, or perhaps the most ingenious? Was it the Byzantine ban on beards, the Viking practice of outlawry, or the intricate bead judgments of the Brehon laws? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the mysteries of the past, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the hidden